Welcome everyone to our event, Sustainable Trade and Voluntary Sustainability Standards here at the Press Club, Brussels. We thank all of those who are here in the room with us, as well as those joined in through Zoom. This event is also currently being live streamed. Um, for those who joined through Zoom throughout the session, please feel free to raise any questions if you have any in the chat, and we will also have a short Q&A at the end, and we will also pass the mic around. Please keep your questions short so that we have the opportunity to have more people asking questions as well. So with that, may I invite Santiago Fernandez de Cordova, Chief VSS Program in UNCTAD, and also the coordinator of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, UNFSS, and Dr. Axel Marx, Deputy Director at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, KU Leuven, on stage to convene this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. Good afternoon. Quite impressive that we're starting on time, but I guess it's ahead of time, it's good. I mean, better than we're based in Switzerland, so it's quite good to start on time. So good afternoon, distinguished guests, delegates, colleagues, partners, and all participants who have joined us here at the Press Club in Brussels and virtually from around the world. Welcome to this dialogue on sustainable trade and voluntary sustainability standards. As my colleague Ruby mentioned, my name is Santiago Fernandez de Cordova. I'm the UNCTAD coordinator of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards. UNFSS is a joint initiative of 6 UN agencies working together on advancing the role of sustainability standards to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Ladies and gentlemen, not long ago, in 2015, we celebrated a historical agreement on a common vision. The SDGs and the Agenda 2030 is the trump of multilateralism and a further step to build a better world. But our ambition for sustainable development have been confronted with cascading crises. COVID-19 and the ongoing war in Ukraine have triggered an social economic crisis. Up to 60% of low-income countries and 30% of middle-income countries are now near debt distress. Food prices are at least 50% higher. Energy prices are about twice, and fertilizers 3 times as high. The number of food insecure people have tripled in the last 3 years, reaching almost 350 million. These demands for a profound transformation so that our aspirations embodied the SDGs towards a tangible objective. And trade, more particularly sustainable trade, must be a part of this solution. Developing countries' share in world exports amount to about 40%, which makes them a key player of international trade, but also the most vulnerable during these crises. Voluntary Sustainability Standards, or VSS, as they are known, can play a pivotal role to change the baseline calculations of global supply chain transformation performances. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a new market reality. Next to international and national standards, VSS have been growing fast and are a fundamental part of global value chains. We are also seeing a continuous rise in regulatory measures worldwide, a rise that would likely accelerate the achievement of the SDGs. Yet, there are not only benefits in regulation, but there are also risks and challenges. In UNCTAD, we pay particular attention to the risk of fragmentation of regulation, which can disproportionately hurt SMEs and producers in developing countries. Regulatory measures are indeed not inherently trade neutral. For this, we gather here today to also invite you to download and read our newly launched 5th flagship report titled Voluntary Sustainability Standards, Sustainability Agenda, and Developing Countries' Opportunities and Challenges. Please download our report, and I encourage you to read it. It is through this report that we aim to show how VSS can play a significant role in public policies and in new policy developments. With that, as we deep dive into today's dialogue, I will let my co-author, Dr. Axel Marx, elaborate on our report. Axel is Deputy Director of KU Leuven Center for Global Governance. We would also like to thank both the Flemish Research Fund of Belgium and the Secretariat for Economic Affairs of Switzerland for their support to the UNFSS 5th flagship. Axel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Santiago. Dear distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, also from my side, a warm welcome. I'm, as Santiago said, one of the co-editors and partially authors of the report we want to present. And I want to briefly go over the report, so to give you a bit of a flavor of what we have been working on and also some of our main takeaways. It's become quite an extensive report, so we cannot go too much in depth, but I want to give you a bit of, let's say, an overview of what we have been doing. The starting point of the report is actually that, as Santiago mentioned, the increasing importance of voluntary sustainability standards, which we also know as labels, eco-certification systems, and so on, especially as an important tool to govern global value chains. And what VSS aim to do is they try to make production processes or producers to comply with a set of sustainability requirements. They have now been operational for more than 30 years, and they have gained increasing attention in different worlds: the business world, the research world, and the world of policymakers. But especially, it's on the one hand, this world of policymakers, and on the other hand, the research world, which we try to bring together in this flagship report. On the one hand, policymakers are increasingly recognizing the possible importance of voluntary sustainability standards. And we see that coming up in many different regulatory initiatives, trade initiatives, and so on. And there's a hope, there's an expectation that the integration of these instruments will foster sustainability. On the other hand, research is also recognized for more than 30 years that this is quite an important innovation in terms of governing value chains. And so they started to conduct research on different aspects of voluntary sustainability standards, how they are designed, how they are monitoring their compliance, and these types of things. More recently, a lot of attention has also gone to their impact on sustainability. And with this, let's say, two aspects, we want to have a flagship report which tries, on the one hand, to rely on scientific evidence, but on the other hand, also to bring together some of the main policy implications which run from that. And from that perspective, we have in the report 5 key objectives. One is to offer an understanding of the opportunities VSS offer for developing countries, and also how that can contribute to their sustainability agenda. We want to try to summarize what we think are some of the main takeaways on current studies of the impact of sustainability standards in fostering sustainable development. Based on that, we try to identify the opportunities they offer, and then also try to discuss some of the challenges developing countries might face if they want to further engage with voluntary sustainability standards. That is then, towards the end of the report, put in a broader context of other developments which feed into the development and which feed into the development of our voluntary sustainability standards. And on the basis of that, we want to provide some policy recommendations. And in order to achieve these objectives, what we have done is we have brought together 15 experts of people working on voluntary sustainability standards. And we tried to have experts on the one hand from academia, on the other hand from the policy community. We wanted to have experts who provide different disciplinary perspectives, because when we talk about sustainable development, we talk about social issues, we talk about environmental issues, we talk about economic issues, and we wanted to cover them in the report. We also wanted to cover different geographical perspectives. because sometimes how VSS play out in developed countries and what we can learn from that might be very different from what we maybe can observe in developing countries. So that brought together 15 researchers who all contributed parts, chapters, boxes to the report. We start the report with pinpointing down the relevance and importance of voluntary sustainability standards. And what you see on the slide on your left-hand side is the rise of voluntary sustainability standards measured on 2 databases over the last 6 decades. And what it shows is that the number of voluntary sustainability standards has grown exponentially, although it has been stagnating in the last couple of years based on the 2 sources. This stagnation is explained by different factors, but I think one important factor is also consolidation of certain voluntary sustainability standards to become really significant players. On the right-hand side, we present for some selected commodities the share of certified production on total production, indicating that for certain commodities like coffee, cacao, and so on, a significant share of production is certified for the moment. In the report, we also detail growth rates and so on. So that's a bit of the context. Growing number of VSS, growing adoption of VSS, growing reach, and so on. And then we reflect on what might that mean for developing countries. And then we try to establish or analyze throughout the literature what are some of, let's say, the positive opportunities, and what are sometimes also barriers for developing countries to engage with VSS. And we try to, based on research, describe those. And these relate to access to markets, these relate to productivity gains, these relate to increase in income in terms of the positive benefits. These also relate to possible positive impacts on achieving targets and indicators for the Sustainable Development Goal. But we also identify in the report that there are also significant barriers for VSS adoption in some developing countries. And these then relate to the cost of certification, sometimes the lack of incentives, sometimes also social political resistance against VSS. With this, we mean is that they are developed mostly in the context of developed countries, which then spread out all over the world. And they have a specific conception of what standards and sustainability is, which is not always shared by everybody. And then challenges related to maintaining certification over time. As I said, we also delved in the report into the different impacts of VSS. And I'm not going to detail too much, but you find quite extensive literature reviews in the report on how they create impact on an environmental dimension, on social dimensions, and on economic dimensions, how they might increase trade or to a degree pose a barrier, how they might increase farm productivity, how they might increase the tackling issues of child labor, and so on. And it's impossible to make a general conclusion like VSS work or they don't work. And you might not be surprised that if you look at many studies, you have many different results. But based on, let's say, some meta-analysis, for instance, databases like the Evidencia database, we can have a bit of a broader overview and trends on what we can see. And overall, we say studies find a positive impact. But we put a big caveat on that. We say on balance. And what does that mean for us is that if you look at a lot of studies, what they typically do is they compare certified entities to non-certified entities. And then they start to try to assess whether certified entities are performing better on sustainability criteria, so have a positive impact, or sometimes that they don't have any measurable difference between certified entities and non-certified entities. And in some cases, there might actually be some negative effects, especially related to cost of production and so on. And if you look over, let's say, more than 70, 80 studies, on balance, there's a positive impact. meaning that we find more studies which find a positive impact than a neutral or negative. But as we say, however, these effects are extremely context specific. They differ between VSS, they differ within one VSS across countries, and these types of things. Second, we also find in a lot of literature that there are trade-offs in the sense that some VSS perform quite well on the social dimensions of sustainability, but less on environmental protection, and the other way around. So scoring equally well on all dimensions is not something you find commonly in many studies. So that helps us to reflect in the report in a separate chapter on what might actually explain a bit of impact of certified of VSS on certified entities in some cases and not in others. And there we delve into the mechanisms which foster compliance with standards and which type of incentives seem to work better in different types of context. So that creates the overall frame of, let's say, establishing the relevance and importance of VSS for developing countries, finding some, let's say, opportunities, identifying some challenges, and then we actually try to frame that in a broader context and to see if we assume that VSS have an important role to play in making global value chains more sustainable, which are some of the developments which might influence that. And there we focus in 4 different chapters on 4 different aspects. One has to do with where we look more closely in how VSS are integrated in what we call broader regulatory governance arrangements, and how, for instance, policies for private sector development might influence the adoption of VSS or not. Second, and that's partially related also to the third point on due diligence, but second, we see a rise of what we call national standards. And these are new initiatives in certain developing countries which try to develop sustainability standards, which are no longer voluntary, but mandatory for the actors in the field, and how these compare to voluntary standards. And we have specific case studies on the Malaysian and Indonesian certificates and systems for palm oil, and we focus on the Eco-Mark initiative in Africa. And then we reflect on what this, let's say, expansion of different types of standards means and what might be the implications for harmonization and mutual recognition. Third, and we might hear more about that later as well, is we focus on what we call this new move or this new turn towards using due diligence as a regulatory approach. I think especially in Brussels, but also in some other countries, this is really the talk of the town. There are many new regulatory measures coming out which implement due diligence, and there's a recognition that VSS play a role in due diligence, but there we need also to think much better and maybe also do more research on what are the implications of this for developing countries and for producers who might have difficulties in trying to comply with that. Finally, we look at how voluntary sustainability standards integrate and combine with different types of other regulatory approaches, and that we call VSS and policy mixes, trying to understand how government regulations might provide incentives or might provide support for the development of VSS and the implementation of VSS. So that's in a nutshell, let's say, the findings, what we try to bring together from the literature. Santiago will now focus a bit more on the conclusions and policy recommendations. Thank you.
So thank you, Axel, for the presentation in a nutshell of the 5th flagship report. I would like to tell you a little bit about the conclusions of the report and then the recommendations. Obviously, one of the conclusions is that developing countries continue to face significant challenges to engage in certification. And this is quite obvious. It's not only a question about having the certification, it's also about the hurdles that developing countries face in terms of the uptake and implementation of sustainable certification. Then the second conclusion is that evidence of the environmental, social, and economic impacts of VSS is incomplete and case-specific. I think we heard a bit of the research findings from Axel, but it's quite obvious that there's need to look into this deeply. And of course, the last conclusion is VSS can play a significant role in public policies and new policy developments. These are the three conclusions of our study, and we provide 5 policy recommendations from our research. The first one is advancing transparency and research on VSS and their impacts. Of course, because we have shown mixed results and very case-specific on specific topics, we should look into the research to rectify its shortcomings and increase its effectiveness. It is necessary to understand not only why standards work, but also why they do not work in some cases. Here we make a call for international institutions, think tanks, in collaboration with governments, certification systems, and civil society. Our second policy recommendation is reducing market imperfections. There's obviously a couple of market imperfections that are making VSS less efficient and less effective. Obtaining certification requires investments, which is obvious that not all producers can afford, particularly in developing countries. Here, we provide a call for providing support to producers to help cover the certification cost. The third policy recommendation is harnessing the role of the private sector. It's obvious that we need to work together with the private sector if we want to achieve the effectiveness of VSS. We do a call for private sector development initiatives to pay more attention to sustainability concerns, especially in light of a limited public institutional and enforcement capacity in some cases. Last, we make a policy recommendation regarding establishing cooperation and mutual recognition. We heard from Axel the emergence of national standards, which can complement VSS. We make a call for transparency and fostering mutual recognition, in particular between national and international standards. The fifth recommendation is preparing for continuously changing developments, in particular in developing countries. Of course, we discussed in the report extensively new regulatory initiatives that can put pressure on producers in developing countries. The introduction of mandatory due diligence measures related to global value chains governance is potentially a game changer. Hence, for us, there's a need for further discussion on some key questions for developing countries. First, how do VSS fit into this new wave of due diligence regulation? Second, how to achieve coherence between international, regional, and national standards. Third, how to foster mutual recognition across standard systems. Fourth, how developing countries can be better prepared to deal with these new regulatory initiatives. Hence, for this, we call for a stronger dialogue and collaboration among partners. So with that, we can move on to the next part, which is basically the dialogue that we intend to have. Let me just mention that the event is being also streamed virtually. So after the dialogue, we'll take some questions here in the room, and also those connecting virtually either through Zoom or the social media can also put their questions on the chat. Let me please invite the panelist members to come, and I'll ask the moderator to maybe introduce the panelists. So please, Bernard, Mr. Bern Langley, Ambassador, and Kristen. Before handing over to the moderator of the dialogue, who will properly introduce our panel members, let me just mention that Professor Dr. Bernard Hoekman, he is also director of the Robert Schuman Center in the European University Institute based in Florence, and quite a renowned, no, I got it wrong. Well, you correct me then. Over to you, Bernard.
Okay, very good. Welcome to everybody here in the room, but also I think more importantly, what I understand from Santiago, there's a lot of people who are listening in. Is this supposed to be in the room? It's supposed to be on. I guess you don't hear it through the loudspeakers, but it is on. So my name is Bernard Hoopman. I am not the director of the Robert Schuman Center at the European University Institute. I am a mere professor in the Schuman Institute dealing with international trade and development. So what I would encourage everybody online to do, insofar as you have questions on the two presentations you just heard, is to write them down in the chat. Because I'm sure there might be interest in asking the author's question, but our role here and in the panel is to have a discussion as to both what you've heard and to reflect a bit upon some of the messages that were just conveyed. So we have three speakers who are going to chip in on this discussion, and it's really going to be a discussion. We're not necessarily going to have speeches. That's not the idea. So we have Mrs. Simone Betten Nayo, who is the ambassador designate for Jamaica to Belgium, but also to the European Union. And she has a long experience working on a variety of things, which I won't go into. What is relevant here is the CARIFORUM negotiations. So she has a good, deep understanding of trade and development. Then we have Mr. Bernd Lange, who probably doesn't deserve or doesn't require any introduction in Brussels, but maybe for the people who are listening in, who is the chair of the INTA committee at the European Parliament. So INTA is the International Trade Committee, and he's been a long-standing member of the European Parliament and has been fulfilling the role of chair for a long time. I don't know exactly how long, but certainly is someone who has really vast experience and is directly engaged in the policy-making process. And then finally, we have Kristin Comives, who is with the ISEAL Alliance. And the ISEAL Alliance is, of course, one of the main actors in this world of voluntary sustainability standards. She is the director of programs at the ISEAL Alliance. So let me start with you, Bernd, partly because we're in Brussels, but I think partly also because, as Santiago already hinted, there's quite a bit of interest in what the EU is doing on the trade policy front, but in particular, I would really like to get your sense of where does the VSS, where do voluntary standards systems fit into all of the various things that are now being done in Europe with respect to trade and sustainable development, right? So we've just had a review of the trade and sustainable development strategy and by the European Union. And so I guess one question is, in your view, how does what is being discussed in the report fit in terms of how you see that going forward? And so let me just start with that. So, Bernd.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and thanks a lot for the question. Indeed, we in the European Parliament really promoted for a long time voluntary sustainable standards. But then we recognize that there are also some weaknesses. Let me mention three of them. One is, of course, the question of transparency. The first slide you show with the whole overview of different labels, a consumer can't really recognize these different labels. And you mentioned as well, some are more focusing on labor issues, some more on environmental issues. So it's not totally clear which SDGs they are really based on. Secondly, we discovered also some voluntary schemes which are really not trustful, organized by companies to defend their interests. And thirdly, we wanted to establish also a level playing field. So we recognized in several product lines that 30%, 60% of companies are respecting volunteering schemes, but we have a lot of free riders which are not respecting any volunteering schemes and any SDGs. And this leads to some competition advantages. And therefore, at the moment, we are going more in the direction of having clear commitments in our bilateral trade agreements and having some unilateral legislation. On the unilateral legislation front, we have the so-called conflict minerals regulation for gold, tantal, wolfram, and tin, to have a clear commitment for due diligence in the supply chain. We will have the due diligence legislation coming quite soon to have a mandatory due diligence in the whole supply chain based on a risk approach. We will have a new legislation to ban products based on forced labor, the import ban, the marketing ban, and also the export ban. And we have a legislation against deforestation, illegal loggings, for legislation, unilateral legislation, which should guarantee a level playing field to guarantee the fundamental international convention. I guess this is also crucial. I know that some of the voluntary schemes are going beyond the fundamental conventions, and this is, I guess, also the role for voluntary agreements. But we should guarantee with strong binding measures that the core ILO standards, that the fundamental environmental convention from the UN, and that the Paris Climate Agreement are respected in an obligatory way. In the conflict minerals regulation, we had the possibility that volunteering schemes could be integrated if, of course, they respect the fundamental values of the legislation. And I guess this should be also the case in the due diligence legislation if it's clear and this is certified that volunteering schemes are really respecting at least the minimal values of the legislation. They should be set as equivalent. And I guess it's important because a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises are really looking on the voluntary schemes, the voluntary sustainability schemes, so that they can be really replace some obligations from the legislation. In our bilateral trade agreements, it's totally clear that we expect from our trading partners the new TSD strategy, which was published by the Commission from the 22nd of June, so that we will have a binding implementation of the fundamental convention, a clear monitoring system, and also enforcement so that this is guaranteed. By the way, we have at the moment 42 bilateral trade agreements with around about 70 countries, and we are going on now for the modernization of this agreement. So what a role is for the volunteering scheme? I guess one is the equivalency to the unilateral legislation. Secondly, really give a additional benefit to the consumer. So like the fair trade scheme, which is really going beyond the fundamental convention, and gives also the possibility sometimes to have a competition advantage, to make advertising that there are some additional elements which might be relevant for some consumers in the voluntary schemes, which gives some certainty. But we have to be clear that also for producers in developing countries, it's not so easy to look through this whole variation of volunteering schemes. So I got some complaints from Kenya, from flour producers, for example, that they have to respect, I guess, if you count all the volunteering schemes in different countries worldwide, 80 different standards. And this is not reasonable for good and economic reasonable production. So let's really focus which are necessary, which give an extra effect compared to the fundamental standards, and which can really give also benefit to the consumer. So this has to be found in a dialogue, and this I'm totally agreeing that this is not a fight between mandatory standards and volunteer standards, we have to really look where we can work together that at the end of the day, the SDGs are really proper implemented.
Thanks a lot. So if I paraphrase, so in a sense, we're looking for minimum standards that are mandatory, where the minimum is not really minimum because they're really tied to these international conventions, which have often been agreed among countries. So that, I think that really does leave the question then in terms of also some of the things that were elaborated in the report. And I think your example of the flower exporter is a good one. You know, what do we do to help firms kind of deal with this explosion, the heterogeneity that exists across standards, across markets? So one of the things that is proposed in the report is to think about equivalence, to think about recognition among standards things. And I think one of the things we might come back to is to what extent that can actually be encouraged by governments insofar as I know it's happening to some extent among the standard setters, but again, what could be done to actually help that process? So, Mrs. Betinayo, so what is your take as someone who comes from a small island state in terms of this whole debate and this whole issue of, you know, so do you think, do you see any salience for your country in terms of, you know, what the report is dealing with in terms of the voluntary standards as an instrument relative to other types of instruments, which are, you know, trade agreements, the mandatory approach, which is now increasingly being pursued by countries? So.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you very much to the forum for inviting Jamaica and for taking the discussions. So Brussels, I understand your previous launch of your previous reports were done elsewhere, largely in Geneva. And it's significant because, of course, we're at the heart of Europe, and this market is a significant one, is an important one for us. Professor, you have asked a question of regarding our take on this process. We have been particularly intrigued with the developments of VSS. We see the impact that they have on global trade. We can't ignore the fact that they are present. We can't ignore the fact that they contribute, they play a significant role in global trade. And it's important for us because the external market is significant. As a small island state, as a small economy, we are heavily dependent on external trade. We are heavily dependent on the external market. So the extent to which the voluntary sustainable standards have an impact on trade, then we can't ignore them. We have to pay particular attention to them. And there are signs that already countries like Jamaica are implementing aspects of them. For example, fair trade, and there's interest, for example, in organic and other forms of standards. But the volume, the proliferation of standards is a cause for concern. You mentioned the case involved in Kenya. So there's a capacity challenge. And we want to be in a position to be able to meet these standards. And the reality is that we're not always in a position to meet them. There are cost factors, and I'm pleased to see that this was one element that was emphasized in the report in terms of your own findings. They're quite costly. Just the certification and implementation, the maintenance of the standards. So that is also an issue of concern to us. The governance framework is very critical because we have been asked to implement standards, and we have not been part of the framework that designed them in the first place. So the emphasis on the need for more inclusive governance mechanism is very important, and we support that wholeheartedly. Because the whole notion of sustainability is important for us. We are small and vulnerable. We're an island state, so our livelihoods depend on sustainability. And so, and the implementation of the SDGs. So we have an interest in the issue, and we know that it has an impact on trade. But how do we manage the process to ensure that we're not made any worse off? How do we manage the process to ensure that trade is expanded, that we're able to export more? Is an important market, and I mentioned the EU market in particular. It's a market that's highly sophisticated. where standards are being promoted by consumers, largely the private standards by consumers. It is a market that comprises over 450 million consumers. We have to pay attention to it. And so how do we ensure that going forward, we have a system in place that will allow countries like Jamaica, small countries, heavily dependent on trade, are not made worse off. And what it will require is that the cost element be taken into account. We're part of the governance mechanism, and technical assistance. So technical support is also required, MEP, because without that, because some of the standards, we're not even sure how to implement them. And the whole issue of the scientific basis for some of them as well. We have to also consider those important factors. The notion of mutual recognition is an important one. It's not unique. We recognize that it is it's one possible solution. But then how would it mutual recognition work in a scenario when we're dealing with a standard perhaps that is unique to a developed country because of the nature of the standard and the geographical factors and other factors that are unique to that country because the country is found in the north? How would mutual recognition work when you're dealing with a tropical country? It's a standard that is unique to that particular market. So you would have to consider many different variables in order to determine a way forward. And so I mentioned the governance framework, a mutual recognition. The cost factor is also an important element that we need to take into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Kristen, just to follow up on some of the things that have just been said, and also that came out in the presentation of the report, in particular, focusing on kind of efforts by the research community to identify what are the effects of these different standards systems. And in particular, a lot of the literature focuses on effects on the producers, right? They're focusing on the effects of smallholder farmers. They're looking at price premia. And as was just mentioned, we have this kind of trade-off between, on the one hand, how can we reduce costs associated with these systems, and how can we increase the benefits? That's one way of posing that in terms of, and of course, the benefits would be reflected in a price premium. But one of the things that was emphasized also in the presentation is we see this huge variance in terms of products, countries. Within a standard system, we see differences across countries. So as someone who's really immersed in this, what would you say are kind of ways of dealing with these factors, kind of reducing the cost, increasing the benefits, and at the same time, recognizing that it's not just about economics, right? Because if we're talking about sustainability, clearly there's an environmental dimension, which we should be internalizing. So now your thoughts on all this would be very welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to be here. I first want to congratulate you on the report. I thought you did a really good job of pulling together a lot of information, and it will definitely be on our Evidencia website very soon. Okay, so your question of how we can deal with the differences in the impacts across locations, how we can increase the benefits and how we can increase the costs. There are many different ways to answer that. Let me start with the benefits for whom. So if we talk for those who are the certified entities or those who are engaging in the certification first to recognize that the benefits are partially financial. They can also be about the outcomes on, say, sustainable land use and what that brings. But there are also a lot of business benefits in terms of business relationships, recognition, market access, et cetera. So unlocking each of those different pieces requires different types of action. The market access piece in particular, I think, is particularly related to the sort of trade questions that we're thinking about now. And perhaps I could tell one story about how governments and voluntary systems can work together to try to increase market access. So this is a story about the Marine Stewardship Council, which is a wild fisheries standard. In the case of Suriname, the seabob fishery there was interested in improving its sustainability performance, but there's a problem with a lack of data about the fishery, which is a problem many developing countries face. That data just doesn't exist, which would make it very difficult for them to actually access MSC certification. And so two things happened to make it possible for them to become certified. One was that MSC itself it was involved in innovation around its assurance process. So looking at risk-based approaches to how do you deal when you're with missing data. So they made some changes to help make it more possible. And on the other side, we had the government of Suriname, who also invested in over a 2-year period, getting all the fisheries data that was necessary. And that combination made it possible for producers to come together. So I guess one message I'd like to say about increasing the benefits is really thinking about how different parties can work together to make that possible. On the cost side, I think a really important aspect to think about is there's the cost of certification itself. There's a cost of traceability, which are systems that have to be paid for by someone. And you have to be careful about the possible negative effects of some of these requirements, because we can actually increase that service cost or system cost, right, that we have to be aware of. But there's another really important cost, which is simply the cost of getting production up to the level of sustainability that we're looking for. And that exists whether or not you have standards. Anyone who wants to increase their production system up to expectations is going to have to make investments. And here is another place where I think voluntary standards can also work with the finance sector and governments to figure out how to actually get money flowing and financing flowing to make those necessary investments. So the cost, let's not forget about that side of cost, I guess, as well as we go forward. And if I could just mention two other things around mutual recognition, which was mentioned here. We agree is very important. We've been working for many years on trying to figure out how to make it possible for sustainability standards to collaborate with each other. You mentioned some examples of that. One of the really important points is that we have to look not just at the content of the standards or requirements, but also at the systems that are under the requirements. What is behind that? And what we find in efforts to establish mutual recognition is that it's often these systems elements that are the bigger barrier. So to give you a very concrete example, the assurance systems, this is the systems that are used to check whether something actually happened, could be in one case a self-assessment, and another case could be a third-party auditor. So even if the requirement is the same, the level of assurance that you have is very different. And so it's hard to ask a third-party system to recognize a self-assessment in that sense, right? So how do we get around that? One of the things that ICEAL does is we have credibility principles that reflect a global understanding of what it means to be a credible sustainability system. And we have codes of good practice that turn that into practice. So what would you have to do as a system, as a scheme, in order to be credible? When systems are built around some common foundations like that, then it makes it easier to think about mutual recognition. And how does this then relate to governments also? So governments are also involved in the development of regional or national systems, voluntary systems, sometimes mandatory systems. When those systems also take into consideration a number of these principles of credibility, it makes it much easier to see the mutual recognition. Much more to say, but I'll stop there.
But just to follow up, so what would be a concrete kind of suggestion on your part in terms of encouraging that process? Right.
The mutual recognition process.
Yeah, and then to kind of deal with these issues, so just off the top of my head, if we're going down the due diligence route, right, through the European Union's proposed directive, how could you leverage that to actually deal with some of these issues? Do you see potential there to do that, or are these really, and should they actually be different worlds?
Oh, no, that definitely should not be different worlds. So maybe just in general, VSS and due diligence, we definitely see that they are not the same thing, but there are opportunities for voluntary standard systems to help provide some of the assurance that's needed, some of the data that's needed, some services like risk maps, some a guide to how you can do remediation and how you can do mitigation. So these things standards can provide, but they are not taking away the responsibility that comes to companies from due diligence. Now, how does that relate to mutual recognition? I think it is a real call to all of us to pay much more attention to the need to work faster and harder on mutual recognition. And this is because there is a real danger with the due diligence regulation that we're going to end up with many, many more systems. So individual companies setting up their own system, companies setting up a system, others setting up system, and not just voluntary standards, but also pieces of it, like traceability systems or other things. So I think it's just a call for all of us to sit down and really think about what does this look like in practice. Unfortunately, a lot of it is really technical detail, and there's almost no way around sitting around the table and talking about the very specific details of how are we going to get this done. But there's a lot to be learned in one conversation like that others can then pick up and apply in different places, I think.
Maybe this is a bit out of left field, but one of the things that strikes me from some of the things that have been, that we've discussed is, so the European Union has a large aid for trade program. So Rand, do you see a role, and all of you, do you see a role for kind of using that more as an instrument to actually deal with some of these kind of requirements, in particular the role that the government should play to actually, provide the public goods that are needed, which are not going to be provided by firms?
No doubt about, and we are really trying to switch a little bit the aid for trade in this direction. And I personally organize always a meeting with the heads of the EU delegation to exchange of best practice. So specifically regarding sustainable schemes like fair trade, so to organize fairs to bring producers and consumers together to really support the ability of certification, also trying to reduce the cost of certification, also the standards to be increased. So a lot of possibilities to use the aid for trade. It's a lot of money, by the way, for really support the possibilities for sustainability standards. And we should really focus on that, because you are quite right. It has to be also, they can play a role in the legislation process we are faced with.
Thank you. So we have a bunch of questions that have come in from our virtual audience. Let me start with a couple of questions from them, and then maybe if you could think about questions you want to pose to the panel for the people here who are in the room. So let me start with a question from Vera Torstensen from Brazil, who is actually a member of this group. And she says, after so many years of work, it is time that the group starts studying and proposing what are the core standards that are similar to what we find in the technical barriers to trade agreement in the WTO. And of course, this goes into kind of a tension that has been in the WTO for a long time between how do you deal with private standards in the setting of the agreements on sanitary, phytosanitary restrictions, technical barriers to trade. So any takes on that would be very welcome. So who wants to take that one? Okay, Simo.
It's a pertinent question. The extent to which voluntary sustainability standards are affecting global trade, then invariably, or perhaps it is irrefutable that it now needs to be considered within the context of the WTO. The issue of transparency has been raised here today. Concerns regarding the proliferation and whether they're justified. And I think those questions ought to be raised within the framework of the relevant WTO commitments that have been, committees rather, that have been established, because we want to be sure that they are not will contribute to global trade, and that they are necessary in the context, within the meaning of the WTO, to treat with the human health and environmental objectives that we're seeking to address and to achieve with the implementation of these standards. And so the fact that, in view of the fact that they do have an impact on global trade, we think that it is relevant for them for the discussion to continue. The discussion has already commenced in the WTO, and for the discussion to continue, and the time, I think, for them to be brought within global trade disciplines, because for us as developing countries, we want to be sure that these standards are seeking to achieve the legitimate objective that they have set out to accomplish, and the right forum, I believe, is WTO, or one of the important fora for this issue to be addressed, is the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to come in on this one?
If I could just follow up about iSteel's codes of good practice, as I mentioned before, are designed with the principles and ideas behind WTO in mind, and particularly in things like standard setting and who's involved in these kinds of things. I just wanted to mention that we are currently undergoing a revision of our codes of good practice, and it's an excellent opportunity for anyone who wants to look at this to see the new codes and provide your feedback about whether you think changes are needed. Remember that our codes guide what other voluntary standards do, right? So we're trying to say this is what the world says good practice looks like. So I would really welcome any of you to look at it from this trade angle and give us your recommendations now.
So one of the issues, and there's a big discussion going on about how we reform the WTO with various proposals. It seems to me like this is a ready-made topic to have a thematic discussion in the technical barriers to trade committee. So that's just as an aside. Another question, and then I'll go to the floor here, is what has been the impact of the whole voluntary standards systems kind of broadly defined in terms of incentivizing developing countries to actually start implementing mandatory systems, right? So this is one of the things that was mentioned in the report, but is this kind of a general trend? Do we see a lot of this happening or not? So I don't know who wants to take that one. I wouldn't know what the answer is. So, no, the question was, so that there was this, the question was, to what extent have the VSS systems and the proliferation of VSS standards actually encourage and incentivized governments, developing country governments, to start regulating and imposing mandatory standards in the areas that are covered by the VSS? So the report mentions Malaysia, Indonesia, but do you see that as a general trend? This is idiosyncratic.
No one wants to stick their neck out. I'll try. I don't think I would say it's a general trend. I think there are some important cases of that. And, we fully recognize the importance of and the need for standards to be representative of what is needed to achieve sustainability in different places, and also of ownership in different places. So sometimes it's a national thing, sometimes it's a regional thing that also exists now. And I would say, I think there's a bit more complexity than came out in the report about whether they're necessarily national mandatory. There can also be national oriented voluntary standards, also on a regional basis. They're not necessarily low bar leading to higher bar international standards. You can have very demanding local standards also coming out of developing countries as well. And let's also recognize that some of the international standards are actually based in developing countries now in some important sectors. So I think there's I don't think there's a general trend, but there's a lot of interesting developments with involvement in this area from many different places. So that's my view. I don't know if others have something to add.
Totally agree. I guess we have some examples on specific cases, but of course we have also countries which are really in a pressure from other factors where such a development is not possible. We have now the Cocoa Initiative with Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, where it's clearly that because of the economic environment, some general standards based on voluntary standards are really not possible. We have to change other conditions. So some examples, yes, but not a general tendency.
Please, gentleman in the back. Go ahead.
Good afternoon to you all. My name is Rogério Correia. I'm from the Brazilian National Platform. Indeed, I'm a technical best trade officer, and I want to make the following question to the representative of the EU and perhaps to the ICO lady. 30 years ago, European Union passed to the same crossroads that we are now. So I agree to that we are discussing mutual recognition. European Union faces these issues and in mutual recognition of technical regulations in Europe. For example, we studied the case of Cassis de Dijon, where some countries have to recognize the technical requirements, technical regulation of others, and so established a policy called New Approach. So the question is, why not use this experience to tackle this issue of mutual recognition or voluntary sustainability standards as experience? And thank you very much.
Let's take a couple of more. Yes, the lady here.
Thank you so much for the report and for the panel. I have a question that extends the frequent references to transparency and standard setting. We know that 30 years ago, standards came out of civil society organizations and social movements, and that they were setting the standards. And today, we have public consultation periods where corporations can put in their 2 cents and often do at a rate that is more frequent, from what I understand, than other organizations. So how can we think about transparency and also at the same time take into account the role that corporations are playing in standard setting as opposed to civil society and social movements? I'd be interested in perspectives from all panelists interested. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one more and then we'll go to the panel. Yeah. Yes. Well, look, please. There's too many questions.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your report. I'm Andrea Mogni, and I'm a specialist in sustainability. I have 2 observations and then a couple of questions. The first observation is that in the European trade agreements with all the rest of the world, including Singapore, Vietnam, I'm talking about Korea, and also the modernization of European trade agreement with Latin America, including Mercosur, there is a very little reference to this issue. So, I mean, I strongly suggest to either to renegotiate some items of these agreements or to set up some protocols specifying exactly what we are talking about in these bilateral trade relations. First point. The second point is a suggestion to UNCTAD. We have a very bad experience in Europe about the voluntary non-financial reporting. This was something that was considered, was suggested that many multinational corporations in Europe made their own voluntary non-financial reporting, but few of them. And this is why today, now we are talking about a mandatory non-financial reporting. There is a European regulation on that, mandatory non-financial reporting, including disclosure, including transparency, including risk assessment, etc., etc. So the same suggestion is to UNCTAD. If you are talking about voluntary, I think that this is a no starter. And in addition, I wonder if this kind of problem can be incorporated in the G20 agenda, or even in the Sharm el-Sheikh climate agenda, because it's something that is related to climate, is related to environment, is related to governance. So it could be interesting to have this kind of insertion of this notion into the G20 agenda, for instance, in Bali. My two questions are the following. One is about incentives. Have you noticed any kind of correlation between reporting on voluntary reporting on sustainability and the share value of companies reporting? Have you noticed any correlation between this kind of reporting and also the rating agency, the rating made by the rating agencies? The rating agencies are making now green rating. So have you noticed any kind of correlation in this respect? And thirdly, from a European perspective, we have a GSP plus instrument. This is a kind of an important incentive in order to facilitate ESG implementation by the developing countries, which, by the way, are our partners. Can we use this GSP plus instrument more effectively? And my last question, my last issue refers to the new proposal coming from the European Commission on sustainable due diligence initiative. This sustainable due diligence initiative is a responsibility of enterprises, is a responsibility of European enterprises. And by the way, this legislation is expected to be extended to the global supply chain of these European enterprises. So this question is not only for the governments, it's not only for international organizations, but is for enterprises, including banks, including financial advisors, including financial investment funds, including financial market. So, it could be interesting next panel to have also some representatives of the European industry, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who have to implement this obligatory regulation on sustainable due diligence. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we have a lot of questions. We have very little time, but Santiago told me that we can go over past 4 o'clock. So let's just go down the row in terms of, just pick up what you would like to.
Okay, I'll pick up two. So I'll start with a question about civil society and social movements. So first, many of the first sustainability standards started with the idea of multi-stakeholder governance. So although the standard setting bodies themselves were, and actually many of them still are, mission-driven nonprofit organizations, as are we, by the way, as ICEAL, they do embrace a multi-stakeholder governance. So hearing from the different parties is critical to finding solutions that are actually practical and reflecting how society's changed views of sustainability are moving forward. But I think the point that you raise is a really important one, and that is that the ability to participate in consultations is different for different stakeholders. And one of the problems is the more standard systems you have, the more spaces civil society needs to be represented in. And so we have done some work and would be interested in really thinking about what are some solutions to that, besides mutual recognition, but also what kinds of innovations would make it possible for civil society to be represented more easily in these discussions. I think that's an important one for us all to think about going forward, because it is definitely a challenge. And actually something maybe for governments to think about as well. So if you really believe in multi-stakeholder standard setting, what are governments and others and even business doing to make sure that these voices can be at the table? I also just wanted to pick up a little bit on one of the questions you raised, sir, about the issue of information of what evidence do we have about what works on legislation. So I'm not going to enter into the specifics, but I do think within the voluntary standards community, we have said that it is very important for standard systems to be doing research on themselves, to be engaging with researchers like we've seen here, to being very transparent about what works, what doesn't work, what could improve, right? That's something that we believe in. That's part of our codes of good practice. That's why we have the evidencia.eco website. But what you'll see if you go on that website is that there is a lot more evidence about VSS impacts than there are about almost any other kind of instrument. And that shouldn't be the case, right? from everything from legislation to ESG ratings to other things, we should really be looking holistically at what is the evidence of impacts and what works and doesn't in all those cases as well. So I can only just underscore the point that I think it's important to understand more about what works.
On the certification and transparency of schemes, I guess it's really important that we have also some independent overview about the promises of the standards. I will not judge which standard is the right one. I remember quite well the discussion we had in Germany between different angles of the fair trade movement. Is it fair trade if you're using the normal dealer, or you have to establish an own dealership because the normal dealer have also some profit interests which might be not in line with the clear fair trade system. So I will not judge about that. We have to be clear that the different schemes have to be transparent as possible and have to be independent, not certified, but checked. That's the crucial one. Secondly, on our trade agreements, we have in the modern trade agreements a formulation which read, promote and implement fair and ethical schemes. So that's much more than in the past in our trade agreements. Recognizing that the step from this voluntary schemes to standards in our trading partner countries has to be decided as right to regulate from the partner countries as well. But this promotion and implementation is in. And thirdly, on the GSP, we had a really tough discussion about that. Of course, GSP is giving a lot of preferences to more or less all products and for the LDCs for all products beside arms. Where we can find additional benefits for volunteering schemes, it's not so easy because tariffs, there are no tariffs anymore. So we discussed a little bit about the trade facilitation, the bureaucratic burden at the border and so, but it's so limited compared to the bureaucratic efforts we have to make for that. So at the end of the day, we have no specific regulation for voluntary schemes in the GSP proposal.
Yes, I just wanted to share my perspective on the issue of transparency, and that is perhaps one of the main justification of bringing all this discourse within the confines of the WTO, because there's a notification procedure. And that also assists tremendously with the transparency of these standards. Once you're notified and you're aware that they exist. Because developing countries like ours, when we participate, whether global trade at the multilateral level or bilaterally with the EU or with any other country, the provisions of those trade agreements are utilized by private sector to develop their own business strategy. You look at your rules of origin, you look at the standards, etc., and you design a mechanism. Your quality infrastructure is sort of built around what you know that exists in terms of standards. And when new standards are developed, voluntary standards, and we are not aware of them, they can have a serious implications for your entire production, your production process. And so transparency is critical in that sense. We need to know what they are. They need to be notified somewhere. We need to understand them. Our private sector needs to be aware. Civil society also needs to be part of the process. And they need to be disseminated. And so where that doesn't exist, then it has a major impact on trade. And what we are trying to ensure is that it does not affect countries like ours and our ability to participate in the global trading system, participate in markets like the EU market. Otherwise, you run the risk of countries pulling out of those markets and entering into other spaces where the standards are not as rigorous and stringent. So the notion of transparency is very critical, and we are mindful of the notification process and the procedure that exists within the context of the WTO. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I think we should stop now. I think not all questions were answered, and I don't think we ever will, but I think there were a number of good points brought forward. I think that is particular something directed to what UNCTAD and the UNFSS might do looking forward. And I certainly agree that there's going to be an increasing, I think one of the things that the due diligence type of movement is going to bring, it will inherently bring much more interest by the private sector, by the businesses, right? So I think that will kind of endogenously get them to be more involved and in this. But I think that's really something for the UNFSS to think about. And also, I think the other question was, so where do you draw the boundaries, right? So what are we talking about? And I think it's clear that these boundaries are becoming quite fuzzy between mandatory, voluntary, but also it's no longer just product standards. And I think the point you made on non-financial reporting is a good example of that. And I think that's something for us all to reflect on in terms of, okay, so is this part of the agenda or not? That's something, again, that I think is really important to think about. Okay, so let me thank the panel for this. Now we're going to have Ralph Peters, who is with UNCTAD, who is going to give us some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Bernard. I think we have had a very interesting discussion and we have a very solid report in front of us. I'm not going to summarize it. Bernard, you have already picked some very important points. I think what I take from this discussion and the report is that many challenges remain for developing countries. So we have had the cost of becoming certified, the whole engaging in the certification process. The governance issue was mentioned. Developing countries are often not part of the design of voluntary sustainability standards. The link between national and international standards, transparency was mentioned quite often. Small and medium-sized enterprises have a very big challenge here. One of the examples was that some flower exporters have 80 different standards in front of them. So many challenges remain. But also, I think we have heard quite a number of positive elements from voluntary sustainability standards. And I think that's quite important. So we had one very concrete example of the MSC certificate, but also the report finds that overall there is a positive impact on voluntary sustainability standards on the environment, social and economic impact. So that's very positive news. More needs to be understood, I think, about voluntary sustainability standards, and that came out very clearly. When do voluntary sustainability standards really have a positive impact? What are exactly the conditions when they have a clear positive impact? What can developed countries do to support making it work for the people in developing countries? What's the relation of voluntary standards to mandatory requirements that was discussed? And I think that needs to be explored further. So, yeah, we will continue with the research on this. I think that's very important. And that leaves me only to thank our panelists, Mrs. Simone Bertonayo, Mr. Bernhard Lange, Mrs. Christine Komevis, also our moderator and presenters, Dr. Bernhard Lange and Dr. Axel Marx. I would also like to thank our partners in the UNFSS forum, FAO, ITC, UNECE, UNEP, UNIDO. Some are also here. And I would like to thank my colleagues, the team led by Santiago Fernandez de Cordoba, Ruby Lambert, Rupal Verma, and Nima. So thank you very much. UNCTAD will continue to work on this, and we count on your support for this, that we achieve to make this work for developing countries. Thank you.